Hello, welcome. Thank you for joining us this afternoon or early evening, depending on where you are. Before we get started, I will just do some brief introductions. I'm Stacy Sutton. I'm an associate professor of urban planning and policy at the University of Illinois Chicago, or UIC, and the director of applied research at UIC's Social Justice Initiative. So we're super excited that you're joining us this afternoon. For those who don't know, the Social Justice Initiative is a university-wide initiative that advances racial and social justice by nurturing intellectual insurgency and furthering the production of knowledge that seeks to change the world. We do this by connecting scholars and activists inside and outside of the university with community-based social change agents in our city, the country, and globally. SJI has a number of initiatives or projects. I would just note a few of them, such as the Social Justice Portal Project, which we've been launching. We launched 2 years ago, and it is in the end of the second year. And that was, or is, a collaborative, it's a movement-centered think tank that brought together over 100 scholars and activists to talk about racial, social justice, and critical issues of our time related to climate justice, economic democracy, and racial capitalism and abolition. Another important project within SJI is the Pipeline to Justice Scholarship and Mentoring Program for those, for activists that are interested in furthering their education, their undergraduate education. We also have the Chicago Justice Gallery, which is on the campus or off campus of UIC. And we have other things that we do, or events like this. We have public events and public programs. So today's a book event, the book event Translating Blackness. We have the pleasure to have Lorgia García Peña in conversation with Dr. Barbara Ransby, who is the director of SJI. But before we start that conversation, I'll just give you a few housekeeping items that you should know. So by the end of the conversation, we will have time for questions from the audience. So if you have questions, please use the Q&A button and submit your questions at any time during the talk. Right? You can wait till the end, but submit them at any time during the talk. And if you'd like to use closed caption, you can do so. You should click the double C that you see, the double C button on the bottom of the Zoom screen to use it. I should also note that the Social Justice Initiative, or SJI, is honored to co-host today's event, Translating Blackness, with UIC's Latin American and Latino Studies Department and the Rafael Cintron Ortiz Latino Cultural Center. For those who are not familiar with the Latin American and Latino Studies Department, it is a vibrant interdisciplinary unit that is devoted to cutting-edge research, teaching, and community engagement that focuses on Latina and Latino and the Latin American populations, both locally and beyond. And the mission of the department is to produce knowledge about the social, political, economic, and cultural processes that shape the Latin American and Latina experience, to prepare students with a strong foundation of skills and knowledges that enable critical analysis and interventions committed to social equality, equity, racial justice, and human rights, and to promote community and public engagement. So we're pleased that they're co-hosting. And the other co-host is the Latino Cultural Center, which was UIC's first cultural center. It was established in 1976. And the center was born out of out of kind of the mid-70s movements, which also sparked the emergence of the Latin American and Latino Studies Department, which happened 2 years earlier. The Latino Cultural Center emerged as kind of this third pillar of the movement that thanks to visionary Latinx students, faculty, and staff and community members, they fought tirelessly for a cultural center to support the academic growth of the increasing Latinx student body and the population beyond the campus. So LCC was named after the late Rafael Cintron Ortiz, a Puerto Rican professor who unconditionally supported the creation of the center and was an inspirational figure for students on campus and for colleagues. So without too much further ado, we're going to move into today's conversation. But if you hear information that excites you or that you want to share with others, and it helps you to better understand the world and the complexities of the world around us, and if you're so moved to share, please use the hashtag Translating Blackness. I will drop it in the chat so that you have it. I'll do that in a minute. And let's spread the word so that the conversation reverberates beyond this moment. And so I'd like to introduce our interlocutor for today's conversation, Dr. Barbara Ransby, who's a scholar, activist, and author, and the director of SJI, which we call SJI, the Social Justice Initiative. She's also the John D. MacArthur Chair and Distinguished Professor in the departments of Black Studies, Gender and Women's Studies, and History at UIC. And she is an author of 2 award-winning books, The Ella Baker and Black Freedom Movement, A Radical Democratic Vision, and Eslanza, The Large and Unconventional Life of Mrs. Paul Robinson. She's also the author of a 3rd book published in 2018, a 3rd and important book published in 2018, Making All Black Lives Matter, Reimagining Freedom in the 21st Century. And she publishes and speaks regularly in various venues, from In These Times and Color Lines of the Nation to Democracy Now! And so forth. So please give her a warm welcome.
Thank you, Stacy. Yes, I'm excited about this program. Thank you for that introduction and setup and all the important work that you do. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Lorgia García Peña, who is a writer, activist, and scholar. She specializes in Latinx studies with a focus on Black Latinidades. Her work is concerned with ways in which anti-Blackness and xenophobia intersect the global North, producing categories of exclusion that lead to violence and erasure. And we were just having a conversation before this program about that violence as it's expressed on the border of the Dominican Republic and Haiti at this moment. She is author of 3 books, the award-winning The Borders of Dominicanidad, Race, Nations, and Archives of Contradictions, published in 2016, and what we'll be talking about today, Translating Blackness, Latinx Colonialities in Global Perspective, published in 2022, and of course, the all-inspiring and truth-telling Community as Rebellion, published by Haymarket Books, also in 2022. Additionally, her work has been covered in a number of publications in New York Times, the Washington Post, etc. She is a scholar deeply committed to liberating education and bridging the gaps that separate the communities that she comes from, Black, immigrant, and working class, and the university. Dr. Garcia Peña is also co-founder of Freedom University, Georgia, that is, a school that provides college instruction to undocumented students. And I have to say that is when I first became aware of her work, was invited to participate in Freedom University, and have always been, just inspired by that intervention, that political solidarity, that provocation for other academics to step outside of the confines of the work that we do. She has won a number of prizes and recognitions. Some of them we share. The Angela Davis Prize for Public Scholarship from the American Studies Association, the Margaret Casey Foundation Freedom Scholars Award, and one that is especially impressive, the Disobedience Award from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I didn't know they gave such a thing. So I am really excited to welcome the Mellon Professor and Chair of the Department in the Studies of Race, Colonialism, and Diaspora at Tufts University, my friend and colleague, Lorgia García Peña. She's going to speak to us for about 25 minutes about her work, and then we'll have a conversation followed by question and answers. Welcome, welcome, Lorgia.
Thank you so much. It's so good to be here. I wish it was in person, but imagine that I'm embracing all of you. I have been part of the Portal Project for about a year now, and it's such a joy. And the work that you're doing in the SJI, it's just so inspiring. I'm really in awe of you. I want to thank you both, Dr. Barbara Ransby and Dr. Stacey Sutton, for inviting me, for hosting me. I want to thank the staff, especially Roxana, for the work in organizing this event. You would imagine that it would be easier to organize a Zoom event, but it's not. And I also want to acknowledge the co-sponsors for supporting this event. I was invited to share a bit about my recently released book, Translating Blackness, which is a book that in many ways has been brewing and marinating in me for many years. It precedes my academic work and all the other books and articles I've written, because its central question is really what drew me to scholarship that I now pursue. So Translating Blackness is concerned with the ways in which anti-Blackness and xenophobia intersect to produce categories of exclusion and oppression. In the US, we think about issues of immigration and the exclusion and discrimination experienced by immigrants as separate from the struggles for Black lives, Black freedom, Black futures, when in fact, both anti-Blackness and anti-immigrant xenophobia come from the same place. They are legacies of colonialism. And we're living in a moment of profound division and polarity, even among the groups that are concerned with social justice. So it is hard for us to see at times how the exclusions and injustices of our society, be it sexism, xenophobia, anti-Blackness, ableism, homophobia, come from the same source. They're interconnected in histories of colonialism and slavery. So my book, in many ways, seeks to bridge some of these gaps by helping us think about immigration, colonialism, and anti-Blackness through Latinidad, through the lives, experiences of people who identify as both Black and Latinx. Black Latinx people embody multiple forms of coloniality, the legacies of European colonialism, and the continuous colonial presence of the United States in Latin America and the Caribbean, while also living as immigrants or descendants of immigrants in the global north. They embody overlapping diasporas. So I offer Black Latinidad as an epistemology, as a way of understanding and producing knowledge from the site of unbelonging, from what my dear colleague and friend Christina Sharp calls the unfinished project of emancipation. And I like to think about the unfinished as implying an opening. That which is not finished is still in the making. So Black Latinidad, for me, is not just an embodied identity and a social construct, but a point of entry and a set of methods that move us beyond homogeneous concepts of racial identity and citizenship. My analysis of Black Latinidad in the book denaturalizes the nation as a site of belonging and invites us instead to learn from a productive detour, away from, and in many ways in contradiction to, the colonial order that sustains national notions of citizenship and belonging. And while these are all lessons that can be deduced by reading archives in contradiction against dominant versions of history and accepted hegemonic quote unquote truths, this book asks new critical questions to theorize Blackness in translation in ways that help us think about the ways in which the past is connected to the present, the ways in which our current political moment is determined by legacies of colonialism that continue to shape our nations, our institutions, our universities, reproducing oppression and unbelonging. Chronologically, Translating Blackness begins in the mid 19th century. For those of you who are familiar with my work, as all of my work does, as all of my interrogations of Latinidad do, with US imperialism in the Caribbean. In this particular case, I begin with the US attempt to annex the Dominican Republic during Reconstruction, roughly between 1867 and 1872, as the US state was looking for a viable option to solve the quote unquote Black citizen problem, sending Frederick Douglass as an arm of the US empire. And it ends with 2020 with Black Lives Matter protests outside of the United States, particularly in newer sites and locations of Black Latinx diasporic subjectivity, such as Italy. Or, as I often describe it, it begins with Frederick Douglass and ends with Cardi B. In this sense, Translating Blackness continues my intellectual crusade of expanding the chronological and geographical borders of Latinidad to follow the people who define themselves as Latinos, Latinas, Latine, or Latinx, such as, for example, Afro-Latinx Italians who I study in this book. What I find interesting about these newer sites of Latinx subjectivities is that people are looking at the US and a US Latinx and at the work that we as US based scholars are doing in their engagement with race, ethnicity, and citizenship in the nation in which they live, be it Italy, Sweden, Holland. That is, a Black Latina of Peruvian ancestry from Milan might be looking at New York or LA rather than Lima for a political language with which to contest white supremacy and xenophobia in Italy. This is a process I call translating Blackness. Those dynamics of political and cultural translations are rarely attended to in Latinx studies, and yet they are central to what we in the field call the X in Latinx, to the effort to be inclusive to the diversity of identities and experiences that are constitutive of the communities of people who identified as Latinos, Latinas, Latines, or Latinx, not only to the dominant, hegemonic, heteronormative, whitewashed, mestizo version of Latinidad that has dominated the public sphere in the United States for over 6 decades. So the book proposes Black Latinidad as a theoretical category for understanding the historical intersections of colonialism, migration, diaspora, and Blackness. I argue that Black Latinx people living in the global North, particularly in the United States and Europe, carry with them both the past and present colonial experiences of unbelonging, that be slavery and migration, while often navigating other forms of internal and transnational colonialities. They carry the colonial legacies of Blackness, what Sadia Harman calls the aftermath of slavery, and yet as immigrants, they're doubly excluded from the nation in which they reside, be it the United States or France, and the nation to which they trace their ethnic identities, be it Cuba, Mexico, Peru. Their subjecthoods and bodies are bordered through palimpsestic colonialisms. To put it simply, a Black Latino may be pulled over by the police for driving while Black and then be detained and deported for being undocumented. So their experiences and histories, I argue in the book, can in turn help us make sense of just how Black and immigrant intersect in the new millennium, producing new forms of colonized oppression. More importantly, Black Latinidad can help us see possibilities for transnational, anti-colonial, anti-racist forms of contestation. The act of translating Blackness, I argue in the book, makes colonialism and coloniality visible. And this visibility in turn places local anti-colonial struggles within a recognizable historical continuum. Allow me to show you an example. Meet Tess Asplund. Tess was born in Cali, Colombia in 1972 and was adopted by a white Swedish couple and moved to Sweden when she was only 7 months old. While Sweden prides itself on progressive ideals, inclusivity, and social justice, race and multi-ethnicity are not part of that agenda. In fact, like most of Europe, Sweden imagines itself a non-racial society and insists on assimilation as the only route to inclusion. Thus, Tess grew up Swedish, distanced from her Colombian linguistic and cultural heritage, while simultaneously suffering racism and exclusion due to her ethnic and racial background as a Black Colombian. Legal adoption and Swedish citizenship did not exempt Asplund from anti-immigrant racist violence. Asplund identifies herself as Black, Latina, immigrant, and ethnic Colombian. She explained to me during an interview that her Black Latina identity comes not from her ethnic background or the fact that she was born in Colombia, but from her experiences of unbelonging that shaped and gave meaning to her everyday life in Sweden. From being singled out of school to being asked for a passport on a train to being at the receiving end of racial slurs and anti-immigrant violence on her everyday life. On May 1st, 2016, Tess interrupted a white supremacist march in Bolarg, Sweden. And the photo that you see in the screen is from that march. We have this petite Black woman standing in defiance of white supremacy, her fist up, resonated with activists all around the world, and her actions earned her with the respect and admiration of many. The photos circulated all over the world, including a recognition by the BBC as one of the most influential women of 2016. Jose Coffey, Adela Licona, and Karma Chavez, who have also written about Asplund, analyzed the symbolic significance of her performance of anti-racist defiance, referring specifically to the fist as what they call, and I quote, a coalitional gesture that defies global racism. Asplund's clenched fist, her Black Latina body's interruption of state-sanctioned white supremacist violence, summons the memory of 20th century Black resistance we tend to associate with U.S. Black Power movement. That, as Angela Davis argues, shapes how we understand anti-colonial resistance and freedom struggles across the globe. Asplund herself says she was inspired by Malcolm X and Angela Davis, further evidence that her translation of Blackness to the global narrative of anti-racist, anti-colonial struggles for freedom and justice. For Jose Coffey, Licona, and Chavez, Asplund's raised fists sparkle what they call relational memory work, allowing a transnational audience to engage with Asplund through their own affective, political, historical, and cultural understanding of the raised fist. And we just have to kind of do a quick dive into social media and just see the memes and the hashtags around her to see how this relational affective work shows up in people's engagement with their own memories of anti-racist struggles in, let's say, the 1960s and 70s in the United States. So and just, you know, that is also another, and we'll see another wave of that in 2020 with the hashtag Black Lives Matter, which allowed people in the global South to share the kinds of experiences that they were living outside of the United States, particularly when confronted with police. Visual artists from all over the world interpreted as Bloom's gesture, while memes and videos inundated social media, and political actions by women of color of multiple ethnicities and identifications that name it as Bloom protests spread across Europe and Latin America in defiance of the growth of the extreme right that seems to be spreading like a virus across the globe. In the process, these interpretations consecrated Bloom as a global icon of anti-racist racism. Her embodiment of Black political performance against white supremacy points to two significant processes that are foundational to my theorization of translating Blackness: the cultural translation of specific local context to the world through the interpolation of recognizable symbols, and or the language of hegemonic Blackness, and the contextually specific engagement of racialized immigrants' experience through the language of Black liberation and resistance. As Bloom's Blackness is translated to the global audience through a recognizable symbol of Black power, the fist, and in turn, this translation establishes her belonging and solidarity beyond the nation. Her identity as a Black Latina from Sweden, however, shifts and refocuses her historical interpolation of the fist, summoning a specific colonial diasporic experience, the confrontation with white supremacy in Sweden's anti-immigrant climate following the 2015 quote-unquote refugee crisis that overtook places like Sweden. So Black Latinidad contradicts her oppression and reminds us of the parallels and intersections between Blackness and immigration in the present. Now, the significance of U.S. Black politics and the legacy of U.S. Black struggles for freedom have made visible a multiplicity of colonial exclusions and discriminatory regimes, as well as the resistance to those forms of exclusion that U.S. Black people have exercised for centuries. Angela Davis writes, and I quote, "Black struggles in the United States serve as an emblem of the struggle for freedom." He goes on to note that the Black radical tradition is relevant not only to Black people in the US, but also, and I quote, "to all people who are struggling for freedom, including Latinx, LGBTQI people, immigrants, Palestinians, indigenous, and incarcerated people." Engaging U.S. Blackness, as Davis described, is an example of translating Blackness, embodying, engaging with, interpolating, and dialoguing with hegemonic Black struggles for equality and freedom. By translating their experiences through hegemonic Blackness, historical actors, organizations, and communities across the globe make their experiences of unbelonging visible to a larger and more powerful constituency, gaining solidarity in their assertions of belonging and their struggles for freedom. So translating Blackness can be an effective political strategy for sharing the hegemony of white supremacy in the nation states through cultural, political, and social media translations, historically grounded in racial struggles for liberation and citizenship, as we see in the example of Asplund. But it can also reproduce other forms of erasure and unbelonging for Black communities across the globe. For example, the image of Asplund does not immediately summon a confrontation with xenophobia and anti-immigrant violence. It produces Asplund as a Black woman protesting white supremacy, but it doesn't tell us that she's a Black Latina facing anti-Blackness due to the rise in anti-immigration, anti-refugee sentiment in contemporary Europe. That is, Asplund engages hegemonic Blackness via an emblem of the Black radical tradition to be visible in the world. But hegemonic Blackness in turn gains her access to a discourse of political dissidence, historical belonging, and global recognition. Her translation allows the world to see her, and in the seeing, formulate questions that may inform a dialogue about non-hegemonic Black. What is happening in Sweden? What are the experiences of Black Swedish people? Or some of the questions that I've gotten are like, "Oh, I didn't know there were Black people in Sweden." Or as Asplund explained to me, and I quote, "People saw this little Black woman and recognized what I did as something we must do, as something we had done. But the picture allowed me to connect with Colombia, to my family, to talk about the ways in which white supremacist violence is affecting all of us non-white people like Muslims and Asians and Latinos. Translating Blackness is only the first step, though, to be seen as a global South person in the world requires the audience to reach beyond the universalizing hegemonic symbol and ask questions about the specifics. To translate Blackness can lead to contest exclusion and demand belonging, protection, and rights within the nation. So just to end, I wanted to share that this book is born from my own experience as a Black Latina immigrant scholar living in constant violence, coming and going between belonging and unbelonging. It emerges out of the necessity for what philosopher Jonathan Lear calls radical hope, the commitment to dream of possibility that from, and I quote, this disaster, something good will emerge. The hope that is held in the face of the recognition that given the abyss, one cannot really know what survival means. In the face of oppression and obliteration, hope and action for another way of being, for a future free from colonial exploitation, is indeed a radical act of possibility. And in that sense, this book is a radical act of hope that contradicts impossibility and interrupts the colonial structures that have led us to live, as Christina Sharp calls it, in the wake of slavery that erases the possibility of Black humanity in the streets and in the archives. And in very concrete terms, I hope this book helps us see that anti-Blackness transcends nations and therefore needs to be confronted as a global issue. That means that when we think about education and as we come up with strategies that might help us locally, we also take the time to understand, for example, the place that we as minoritized people in the United States occupy in the world, and the responsibility that we bear as citizens of an empire in relationship to the global South, to indigenous communities, to immigrant communities in our nation and beyond. It's hard at times for us in the US, as US minoritized people, to understand that two things can be true at the same time. That we can simultaneously be suffering at home due to racial capitalism and anti-Blackness, and also be contributing to further exploitation of the global South people via our participation, for example, in consumer practices that affect others, or by contributing to the erasure of the multiplicity of Black experiences in our engagement with histories of Black oppression and liberation. So understanding our role in the world is critical for creating lasting changes and establishing connections beyond our local environment. And I will stop here, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Now, if we were in the same room, you could hear the applause of your comments, and that's just giving us a little glimpse of the work that you do and the writing that you offer us so eloquently. I want to start off with a couple questions and then invite our audience, our virtual audience. We can't see you, but we know you're there, to populate the Q&A with questions that you might have following up on this. And I have, just a few questions, and I wanted to start with that powerful image of Tess Asplund that you focused on in that artist depiction at the end, to ask a question about unbelonging, and then the flip side of unbelonging, which is belonging. Because it strikes me, I remember that photograph, and it strikes me, and then the comparable one in Ferguson of the woman defying the police, and I forget her name. But, unbelonging also gives us the opportunity to belong to something else. So if it's a diasporic Black community, or in the case of Asplund, also a movement, I guess she's a solitary figure in that image. But of course, she was a part of Afrophobia Focus and a larger kind of political resistance to the neo-Nazi. So can you just talk a little bit about both the oppressive character and pain of unbelonging, but also perhaps the power and strength we find in a different kind of belonging other than the prescribed belonging to the nation state, sort of built on colonialism?
Thank you. I love that question because I would say a main focus on the book is to highlight the multiple ways in which people are co-creating communities of belonging. Not only to fight back against um, the way that we made to belong, but also to sustain themselves outside of the institutions that are constantly putting them. Um, I I think the tension between belonging and unbelonging, which I've written about a lot in different ways. And in my first book, I use the work of Josefina Baez to talk about a nie, which is neither here nor there, and that place in between that. And of course, in Latinx studies in particular, and the tradition of thinking of that in between, in metaphors of borderlands, in metaphors that have to do with the hyphen that many of us have to carry in between our names. It's really helpful for imagining other futures. So what I try to do with the book is, on the one hand, create or not create but document a genealogy of Afro Latinidad, in part because as a scholar of this field, I became very impatient with the production of Black Latinidad as something new, something that people just kind of discovered, as if the people that make up this identity have not existed for hundreds of years. And so I wanted to, on the one hand, trace the history of this term and the way in which people have been engaging with it, both as an anti-colonial term, right? So it first emerges in the 19th century as people are trying to make sense of the U.S. presence, new presence in the Caribbean and Latin America, but also as more recently as a political term against the state and the global north state impositions that name people's identities. And we're seeing this right now with the push to make Latinx a census term, which further erases the fact that Latinx people are of different races, that Latinx people can be Black and white and Asian and so on. So a lot of the work that I do in the book is precisely thinking about the ways in which people who unbelong, because of both their immigrant status and their racial identity, find ways to come together across national borders, and how that has always been the case. And so I begin the book talking about Arthur Schomburg and his articulation of what we now call diaspora. We didn't have the name for it. He called it nations without nations, right? So this idea of there's something beyond the nation state that allows us to connect, both politically, culturally, but in some ways also spiritually and so on. And so I'm really interested in tracing those nations without nations and as they are emerging now in this moment. But I'm also really hopeful in bridging a conversation that allows us to think about immigration and Blackness, or xenophobia and anti-Blackness together. In the US, those two conversations tend to be siloed, when in reality, the majority of migrants in the world right now are Black. And so how can we be talking about this as separate issues when they are A, coming from the same colonial legacies, and B, they continue to oppress the same people, right? So my people that are migrating to places like Italy and Spain and Sweden, right, Black Latinx, were also people who come from the Middle Passage, right? So we're looking at overlapping diasporas, but we're also looking at the ways in which um, multiple diasporic Black experiences are coexisting. Right? So what do we do with people that are fleeing places like Eritrea right now, whose history is not the history of slavery, and yet they're living the cost of slavery too. How do we make sense of those things, and also how do people make sense of those things to come together and create communities that sustain them? So this tension between non-belonging and belonging, I think it's really key.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for asking.
As you're talking about the sort of, people who show up in various parts of the world, forced out by all kinds of colonial violence from the places that they come from. I'm thinking about this, question of how Blackness travels, and both through time, but also in place. I remember my first experience going to South Africa I was on the border of South Africa because we were boycotting, and we didn't go into South Africa. We met with comrades in Zimbabwe, but because of my phenotype, right, in that region, I mean, I was very, very tied to owning, embracing, loving, my sense of Blackness. And one of my South African comrades said, "No, you're colored." And I was like, "Wait a minute." So the way in which notions of Blackness and what labels there are, what identity categories they are, and the meaning in different times and places of Blackness. Can you just speak to that a little bit? I mean, you speak to it a lot, but speak to it.
I love that question. And in many ways, it's one that's central, if not to this book in particular, to the way in which I'm thinking, or the way in which I even got to do Black studies. I come from a country. I'm Dominican. I'm from the Dominican Republic, and I'm an immigrant in the United States. I came here when I was 12, and in the Dominican Republic, the number of terms that are used to name people Blackness, they're very specific, and they're like 12 different names, right? But none of them are the actual literal translation of Black into Spanish. And so you have someone like myself, a light skinned Black Latina with kinky hair, and there's no specific term for that. And so there are all of these different ways to name Blackness, and the way in which that has been translated into an Anglophone intellectual discourse has produced the Dominican Republic as a place that does not engage with that, erasing histories that are really important for how we understand slavery and freedom, for example. The fact that the first revolt of enslaved people happened in what is now the Dominican Republic in 1512. Way before 1619, and that is not something that we tend to study because of misunderstanding, I think, because of mistranslation. And so I'm really interested in taking seriously how people are naming themselves, because if we say that race is a social construct, which we have been saying for 50 years now, we also need to take seriously how each society constructs race. But also, how do you engage with Blackness in a Black nation? How do you engage with Blackness in a predominantly Black country like the Dominican Republic or Haiti, where the language around social movement might not always mimic the language we use here, right? Where how do you read Black women's struggles in a place like the Dominican Republic, where the articulation of said struggle is around issues of class and access, not necessarily naming Blackness? And so I'm really interested in reading through those subtleties so that we can actually make tangible connections. So one of the things I do in the book is I look at a group of women who fought in 1965 United States intervention in the Dominican Republic, and all of these women were Black women. And they were Black women whose work was very much tied to access to education and women's rights in the 60s. That story, we don't tell it within the story of Black feminist movements, because the way in which it has been narrated doesn't explicitly say Black. But the fact that all of these women were Afro-descendant, were reading the feminist work that was coming out of Black women in the United States and Brazil. The fact that some of them were defined the nation state by imitating Afro hairdos that was coming out of the 60s and 70s US, and then being punished by the state, publicly shaved and thrown into jail for doing that. How do you not read that as part of Black feminist movement? So I'm really interested in thinking seriously about translating Blackness in semantically, but also beyond. What are the cultural ways, the political ways in which we can create those connections and understand global South histories as in relation to the work that we have been doing in the US, the work that people have been doing in places like South Africa. Mm-hmm. And I think that we can do that if we're open-minded about the way in which people have been naming themselves, and understand that sometimes it's lost in translation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And, I'm struck by thinking about how race and anti-Blackness plays out differently around the world, in how anti-Blackness and racism has evolved in this country, because a generation after the, sort of the end of de jure segregation, we still have segregation, but the end of the sort of Jim Crow explicit. There is a class element. There's always been a class element. So race and class have never been separate variables, right? But in some ways, when people talk about Black working class people, there's a set of stereotypes. There's a set of there's a willingness to exercise violence in controlling those bodies in ways that class privilege sometimes does give people, it whitens, and so anyway, so it's complicated. Let me ask a question that's popped up in the Q&A, and it's an anonymous attendee, so you can tell us who you are. But the person says, "Thank you so much for this presentation. As a person who identifies as a Black woman who also grew up in a predominantly Latinx community of South Central Los Angeles, while also developing Spanish fluency throughout my upbringing, and use this in various places, how would you distinguish this idea of having a desire to belong to both groups, but also struggle with how others see you, which can sometimes be seen as an appropriation if you don't fully grasp the experience of both groups? What advice or books can you offer to someone like me?"
So I have no desire of policing people's identity. I think policing people's identities. I think that there's a lot of that going on, and I it's not where I would want to put my energy. Having said that, I also have an aversion to seeing words like Black and Latinx being divided by a conjunction, right? Because I think it reproduces this idea that Black and Latinx are two different people. So I would, while at the same time being from LA, it's impossible to ignore the anti-Blackness in the Latinx community. So all of those things are true, and all of those things are happening simultaneously. How you decide to name yourself, and how you decide to live your truth, and how you decide to live the truth that you experience in terms of your lived identities, that's going to be entirely up to you. There are a bunch of books that I'm going to drop on the chat, on the Q&A, titles that you can read to kind of think about the ways in which other people have experienced these contradictions. But there isn't a straightforward answer, except that those of us who live in between, who live in sort of this belonging and non-belonging that Barbara and I were talking about at the beginning, are always going to feel excluded from some spaces and included in others. And it's about finding a tribe. I have no intention of explaining my race and ethnicity to anyone, for example. And so when I enter spaces in which I'm questioned, I don't answer. That's my own sort of rebellion in engaging people who have their own ideas as to what a person should look or sound like if they consider themselves a particular ethnic or racial identity.
Mm-hmm. I kind of want to go back to this question of borderlands and borders, because when we were chatting before the program began, you talked about what's happening right now in Dominican Republic on the border with Haiti, which of course the other side of the island, and so many people have come across that border, and so many people who are of Haitian ancestry have many decades of life and generations in the Dominican Republic. But the fence that's being built, the wall that's being built, the detention centers that are being built, the feminists who are being persecuted, give people a glimpse of how this kind of violent anti-Blackness is showing up in that place on the planet where that you know so well.
The island of where I'm from, which it's divided between these two countries, it's a great example of how colonialism and colonial logic has divided the same people into two nations, and how unnatural national borders are. Right, so you have an island that was colonized by Spain and France, and at some point the French and the Spanish, like it was some sort of child's game, decided, okay, we're just gonna draw this line right here, and that's gonna be the two countries. And what is mind blowing is that when these countries became independent, they respected the colonial borders, right? Which again tells us a lot about how colonizing and colonial the nation state is. And so we've inherited this division. And just like in the United States, when the US became a nation state, the only thing that changed was that the British were in power, and then the sons of the British were in power, right? So we had the same sort of logic and legacy happening in the DR and Haiti. And the majority of the population that lived precisely in the borderlands did not care. They had nothing to do with these two nations. They did not care about different flags, and they continue to be really fluid for the majority of the history of the two nations. And so you fast forward to the middle of the 20th century, and you have this intense moment in which the entire world is thinking of whiteness as supreme, right? In we see what's happening in Germany. We see the repercussions that it's having across Europe and North America, and we also have repercussions in what is now the Dominican Republic and Haiti. And there's a massacre, and the dictator Trujillo kills over 20,000 ethnic Haitians. A lot of them, majority of them, were Dominican born. And that's the legacy of that history. And for the next 50 plus years, you have scholars and intellectuals and institutions justifying this crime. And the way they justify this crime is by rewriting history and renaming the natural border, right, or the natural state of the border as a site of potential danger. the immigrants are coming and so on. They're going to take our jobs. And to that, you add U.S. Colonialism in the region and all of the atrocities that were first rehearsed on the island and then put into place in the U.S.-Mexico border. So things like the Bracero program, first rehearsed in the Haiti-DR border during the U.S. intervention, when the U.S. military brought Haitian labor into the sugarcane barracks to cut cane during the U.S. intervention, creating this hierarchy and institutionalizing this idea that somehow Haitians were blacker than Dominicans and therefore more inferior. Right? And this is something that has been repeated, that has been part of the curriculum that children studies inside kindergarten, that is embedded into the ideologies of the nation state for now over a century. And so in the DR in particular, anti-Blackness is incredibly entangled with xenophobia, in which this idea of a migrant invasion that is the result of our global anti-Haitian hate. The world has been ganging up against Haiti since Haiti became a nation. The Western world has been really trying to take this little nation down because they just couldn't take it that this country was made by Black people. And so all of these narratives are shaping the narratives and the policies, right? We continue to hear about the way in which the Dominican sugar industry exploits Haitian workers, but what we don't remember is that 100% of the Dominican sugar industry is owned by the United States, right? So is it Dominicans? Is it Americans? Is it both? So what we know is that racial capitalism continues to be operating in conjunction with the nation state, right? The Dominican state is doing this to its own people to benefit North American corporations. And that the narrative of the immigrants are coming is very useful for diverting people's attention from the actual problems that are affecting the nation, from the fact that there are so many ways in which the state is not taking care of the people that are paying the taxes for it to exist. So it's leading to very tangible and scary things, right? Like massive deportation of Haitians, be it documented or undocumented, right? So the rallying of Haitian workers just because they quote unquote look Haitian, in the same way that we saw back in 2010 Arizona legislation and empowering police to stop people while driving who looked undocumented, right? So again, these are policies that are not invented in the DR Haiti, but they are taken from the lessons of U.S. empire. And then there's a saying in the Dominican Republic, when the U.S. gets a cold, Dominicans get pneumonia, right? And this is what we continue to see. Right now, we're seeing the afterlives of the Trump administration and the way in which those policies are being enacted in ways in a place where there is less opportunities for check and balances, where the media is completely bought by the state and there is no access to really public information outside of social media, and where people who are fighting against anti-Blackness and xenophobia and anti-Haitian hate don't have protection, not from their state, but also not necessarily from their communities. So it's really scary. I'm really in awe of my colleagues and comrades who literally risk their lives every day to make art, to write, to protest, to go into the street for the rights of people to live in peace, because they are actively risking their livelihoods every day. It's extremely dangerous.
You Yeah, I mean, it's sobering, right? And I want to bring gender in the mix too, because when you talk about your colleagues and comrades there, many of them are feminists. And it echoes the feminists who are in the lead in Brazil, in Argentina, in Chile, in Puerto Rico. The sort of protests that ousted the government in Puerto Rico had, amazing young feminists in the leadership of that, fighting the patriarchy and the movement and the colonial collaboration of the governor. So speak a little bit about gender. I know you also map the experience of queer migrants in some of the work that you do. So how does gender fit into the analysis?
It's central in multiple ways, in part because without an exception, all of the organizations that I've had the opportunity to work with, to learn from, to see at work are led by women and queer identifying people, without exception. And in the DR, in particular, we have seen that the sort of the social movements that we have seen over the last 5 years, especially around the pandemic, have centered women's rights. The Dominican Republic is one of three, I believe, Latin American countries that still penalize abortion. So under all circumstances. So, but it's also one of the country that has the highest femicide rate in Latin America. And where still child marriages and all kinds of rape and abduction are still under the realm of what's legal. And so we saw in 2020, as the world was shutting down, women were taken to the streets in DR, camping outside the National Palace, demanding abortion rights. And as this new wave of anti-Haitian violence that was particularly visible in the way in which women were treated, because a lot of Haitian women who were pregnant were particularly targeted of state violence. And so you would see women in labor being literally thrown out of hospitals and driven to the border. And so naturally, the Dominican feminist movement and the movement in support of Black Haitian lives just intersected because they are, because they are, these exclusions and these oppressions are coming from the same place, right? The patriarchal, hegemonic, white supremacist, heteronormative nation state is doing all of the above. And so it's really striking how brave these women are, how committed they are to thinking about intersections, and how they're articulating this not only in their protests, but also in the way in which they're co-creating communities to support themselves. So there are, I've seen in the last couple of years in the batallas, which are the sugarcane barracks, small collectives of women coming together to create things like mutual aid, networks of support, and networks to create safe houses for some of especially for birthing women, and for trans women that are being targeted by hate groups and so on. So it's really grounded on a feminist praxis of care, I would say, the entire movement.
Mm-hmm. That's hopeful, right? Because a lot of times the on an analytical level it's there, but on the ground, either a feminist politic doesn't get incorporated or articulated, or and people don't always call it feminism, but it's there. I was watching and being inspired by these young Black men and this white woman who was an ally and supporter in Tennessee, who were standing up to about gun violence and were expelled from the, and one of the ones, they're both Jasons, one of them was giving his speech and he said, and condemn patriarchy. And I kind of, I didn't expect it. And, but I was so pleased, the sort of consciousness of this generation, that it's not always there, but when it's there, we appreciate it. And we appreciate that it's something that's not, hasn't always been, we had to fight for that space in Black liberation movements. So, yeah.
Yeah, it is hopeful.
Yeah. So there's another question, and this one is, I guess, really a question about solidarity. It's from Rachel Smith, and she asks, what advice do you have for people who aren't considered part of the community but want to have an impact on building acceptance and making people in the community feel welcome and accepted? How can we help locally or bigger? Thank you for your touching presentation. Your words made me want to become more aware and more involved.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That is really meaningful. I often get these questions from people who really want to be allies and do good, right? And my answer is always the same. The first thing to do is listen. And then when you think you know everything, then you listen some more. It's really critical that we don't go into communities that we don't belong to. And that goes for all of us, of any background, with the desire to do right away. As eager as we might be, the first thing to do is to come in quietly. Make sure you're coming invited, and ask when it's your turn. Ask, what can I do? When we were co-creating Freedom University, which I can't believe it's now like 12 years ago, everyone wanted to teach, and we would get inundated with emails from people all over the country. I want to come and teach a class at Freedom U. But what we needed was drivers. We needed people to drive students to class. We didn't need teachers. So it's really important to folks, if you really want to contribute, to ask how can you contribute, and then to listen. And if that doesn't seem like a very glamorous job, it's okay. That is what is needed. If what is needed is for you to move chairs around, go in and move chairs, and maybe after 5 months of moving chairs, something else. And spend a lot of time reading and engaging with a multiplicity of voices. One of the phrases I hate the most is the phrase "give voice." Oh, it gives me the ick. We don't need to give voice to anybody. People have their own voices. We need to pass the mic. So being able to create spaces for people who don't have access to spaces to be able to speak, and to share the knowledge that they have. If you are inclined to do so, and if you have the privilege of doing so, that would be my invitation.
Mm-hmm. And that message can apply to us as academics as well, because that the privilege of class sometimes, and I always say, I've worked in, Black freedom movement, feminist movement, the larger left for many years, and who we are and what individual privileges we have has to also be something we carry with us. So a lot of academics, go into community spaces and I'm with the people, but go humbly. You don't have to teach and lecture every time. Maybe we just carry a picket sign too. Maybe we just do what everybody else is doing, and not assume that also learning and teaching comes in one direction.
One direction.
So, yeah. I think about that one. There's another comment in the chat, which is, we'll just pass on the information to you, but it's an invitation. Lorgia, thank you so much for your thoughtful activism and words of liberation. I am with Latinas en Poder, a transnational feminist organization composed of Afro descent, First Nations, and rural women of the Americas. Can we invite you to come to an event with organizations and speak in Espanol? So she gives her information. So we will pass that on to you.
Thank you so much. Yes.
Yeah. So, I guess my last question might be to think a little bit more about Freedom University and an expanded notion of Freedom University. To me, it was an invitation to step out of the roles prescribed for academics, for those of us who consider ourselves, radical teachers and committed to movement, to do our work a little bit differently, but also to acknowledge different epistemologies, different sites for knowledge production. And there's various versions of that. We had something here called the Communiversity in Chicago, and there have been communiversities in other places. Of course, the freedom schools of, the civil rights movement, et cetera. And in this Freedom Scholars Project that you and I are a part of, there's been discussion, as I've shared with you, the notion of Freedom Institute and Freedom Schools in LA. Robin Kelly and Ananya Roy are doing freedom schools among unhoused workers and citizens and residents in the LA area. And it's a sort of reciprocal learning. It's not just professors going into spaces and giving a lecture on the history of this or that, but how can we learn together, which is pretty extraordinary. What are some of your thoughts about the sort of lessons, legacy of freedom universities in general, the one that you started and others, as we challenge ourselves to think of, intellectual work in a bigger and more radical way?
I've been thinking a lot about Freedom U lately because I'm writing a short piece precisely for a collection that Ayana Roy is putting together on sanctuary spaces, and the mandate was to think about Freedom U as a sanctuary space. And it made me reflect on those early days of creating Freedom U and the goals that we had, and then the reality. Right? We had imagined, like most projects that come from necessity, Freedom U came to exist very fast and in an environment of emergency. Right? We had been we were working in a state institution, in a state that had banned undocumented students from accessing higher education. And so the context was very politically charged, but also very urgent. And also in a context of the creation of what they call secure communities in Georgia, which basically was a euphemism for, giving police an enormous amount of power to go into communities and raid them, right, and deport people on the spot. So this was the climate in which we created it, and what we had in mind was very small. We thought we were going to just maybe teach a class, for a handful of students who were undocumented and wanted to be in community together learning. And what we learned was that the class was great, and yes, we got to teach a class, which was exciting for all of us teaching and for students in the classroom. But what we really were able to do, and I think what has stayed with me until now, is co-create a community for learning that was a sanctuary, where students felt safe to learn. And they felt safe to learn not because of us, but because of their peers, because everyone who was in that space was undocumented. And that tacit knowledge of, I don't have to explain myself, I don't have to tell you where I come from. We just have to look at each other and we know, right? And you and I, Barbara, know this kind of spaces, right? Where we don't even have to name what just happened. You can just go in and you know exactly what, hetero project looks like, and we just know. And that was really critical for Freedom U. So the main lesson is that the teaching will happen, the learning will happen if the students feel safe to learn. And that's what I took with me from Freedom U to all my classes. To understand that the main thing that I can do for my students is to create an environment in which they feel safe to learn, they feel free to learn, and then everything else kind of happens. And I'm very grateful for that experience because it's made me into the teacher that I am now. I really enjoy teaching. I really enjoy the classroom experience, and I think it's because I have a lot of complicity with my students. there's a common goal, and sometimes it takes a little while, especially with grad students, to unlearn what they've been taught. But once we get to a space in which we feel safe, then wonderful things happen. So it's it was a beautiful experience. It continues to teach me every day, and as you know, we've been thinking a lot about what are some other ways in which we can uh, create other spaces like Freedom Year that allows us to learn in community and to create co-create communities of learning outside of the walls of the university. I'm really committed to that.
Yeah. I think the other aspect of it that is powerful is that it's a space of learning that's not purely transactional and commodified and inside the market, right? So some of us have taught, in carceral settings, going into prisons and being a part of, prison education. And mostly you don't get paid for it. You do it because you want to do it because of an abolitionist commitment. And there's a certain special relationship with students that when they know that you're there, absolutely, because you
want to
be, and
yeah.
Well, I think we don't have any other questions in the hopper, and we appreciate having you for these almost 90 minutes. Are there any final words or thoughts or things you're working on that you want to whet our appetites, our intellectual appetites, to look for soon?
I don't know about soon.
Soon is always a relative term for us. It'll come when it comes.
Yeah, I'm a very slow writer. I am working beginning stages on a book on global anti-Blackness and thinking about from a feminist praxis perspective and thinking about the ways in which Black women are organizing across the globe. And so some of the places I'm looking at are Chile, which tends to fly under the radar because we don't tend to think of Chile as a site of Blackness or a site of anti-Blackness or a site of immigration, and yet it is. I'm hoping to the idea of the book is to highlight stories of women who are engaging in community to fight police violence and anti-Blackness perpetrated by the state. So it's growing in there. I don't know about soon, but it'll happen. The soon I don't know, but it will happen.
Yeah, great. Well, it was great talking to you. Appreciate all of your entire body of work, and by that I don't just mean the publications, everything you do and the way you do it. And Community as Rebellion was, just thank you for trusting us with those insights and feelings, as well as the intellectual, heft of it, of challenging us to think about these spaces we're in and how we do indeed form community and have to form community in a much more robust way. So thank you, and we appreciate you, and thank you for this time. I want to thank my colleague Stacy Sutton and the rest of our SJI team and our Portal Project team, Roxana and Bettina and Nathan, who have helped to make this event possible. So thanks to all of them for all they do every day and for today in particular, and thank you as well. And we'll be in touch soon. And thanks to people for tuning in. Yeah, most of them didn't ask questions, but most of them stayed the whole time. So, yeah. All right. Be well.
You too. Thank you so much.